Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Amanda Ray. So I wasn't planning on making this video because the sound of Tom Green's voice just because of those of you who asked and because I love you guys. I edited this video, like an hour long of him talking a bunch of jibba jabba, and I had to edit because I had to edit out him like name dropping people. He talks about a lot of people from the past. It's like a lot of history, but I do want to say it's interesting how he talks about his prison time, and he talks about how he went to prison for living the principle of polygamy, but he fails to mention that one of the reasons he went to prison was because one of the wives that he was trying to live polygamy with was 13 years old and he impregnated her. So he fails to mention that he went to prison for also raping a 13-year-old. So I just want to preface this for anyone who's new coming to my channel that's like, who's this Tom Green guy? No, it's not the comedian from Canada. It's Tom Green, the polygamist who went to prison for raping a 13-year-old. He had in his lifetime like 10 wives, but I think only like 5 wives stayed with him till he died of COVID. I'll leave the link to that video down below if you're just hearing about this Tom Green guy now. But this is just his full talk that he gave at the order, my polygamous cult. He came and did a speech before joining, and his wives were there too. And this was at the time that his daughter was marrying one of the order boys. So they were getting more and more affiliated. And then obviously he ends up joining and then dying of COVID, and his wives all married one of Daniel's sons. So a lot of information. I don't know if you would really want to watch this video if you haven't seen the other video, and I'll leave that one down below, but it's just a lot of jibba jabba. Let me know down below your thoughts and input. I do think it's interesting to hear the history on things, but he has a way of just making history sound so boring. Anyway, so here's the video, and let me know down below if you thought it was boring too.
We'll go ahead and ask Brother Tom to speak to us.
I just assumed all morning that Brother Paul couldn't see me back there. And I was quite comfortable because I was certain this would never happen. This is only the second time that I've attended a meeting, and I've been acquainted with Brother Paul, some of his brothers, and with Brother Artel for nearly 35 years. And I've been curious about their meetings that whole time. But today I feel a little more connected with the order, since my daughter is back there in the sound booth with her fiance, is going to become part of the order soon. I have other connections with the order. My wife, Linda, is a sister to Denise, and her mother and her brother were living in my home at the time that came to my home to get acquainted with. And he told me that he had spoken with his leaders, and I presumed he meant Brother Artel, before he came to my home. And he told me that they had told him that I was an okay person, and I was very impressed by that. I didn't know that. Brother Artel used to come to my home in Sandy back in about 1981. Fred Collier was holding some meetings and a debate with Max Anderson, who wrote the book, The Polygamy Story, Fiction or Fact. And we began holding those meetings in my living room, but over months, the people attending those meetings kind of outgrew my little living room, and we ultimately held them in a large conference room, or rather an auditorium, in the Dixon Paper Building at the invitation of Brother Artel. But I remember Brother Artel and several of his sons would and his sister artist, Gustafson, would come and sit clear in the back of the living room. And they were very quiet, and unlike the rest of us who felt like we had a lot that we needed to say, they just listened and soaked up what was going on. In time, especially after the meetings, when we were nibbling carrots or celery, whatever it was we had, I began to get acquainted with Brother Artel. And I remember on several occasions visiting with him in his office above Donna's Cafe on Angelo Street off of West Temple. Had some very interesting talks with him there. I've been a student of history most of my life. Even when I was in high school, I used to go up to the institute at the university to take night classes in church history because I was really interested in history. And I still am. And I like to interview people who are older than me when I get the chance. And there's getting to be fewer and fewer of them all the time. And I realized when I was younger, I didn't really appreciate the opportunity I had to interview or talk with or just visit with a lot of the people that I was around. My grandmother was born in 1886, and her and her brothers, they all grew up in Canada, in Cardston. And as a young man growing up, I didn't take advantage of the opportunity I had being around those people to learn about their history. Years later, after many of them were gone, I read accounts that each of them had written down about their history, and I was amazed at some of the things that they were involved in that I had no idea. And I wish that I had an opportunity to go sit down with my Uncle Joe or my Uncle Brig and ask them questions about things that took place. I do remember my grandmother, though, telling me stories about going to Canada when she was 5 years old in a covered wagon. Her father had married her mother in 1885, and they lived in Logan. Her father was the clerk of the Cache Valley Stake up there. The president of the Cache Valley Stake was Charles O. Card. And there were a lot of federal marshals in that valley up there and who were looking for illegal cohabs, specifically looking for women or young women who appeared to be in a family way without a legal husband. I remember going to a reunion in southern Idaho, just north end of the Cache Valley actually, when I was 5 years old. I remember it because there was a log cabin there, and it's the first time I'd seen a log cabin, and I was impressed with the way that the corners of the logs stuck out past each other, and I looked at it and it reminded me of a ladder, and I thought, I bet I could climb that. So I started climbing up these logs. And this real kindly white-haired old man that everybody called Uncle Oz came over. I remember he had a big white handlebar mustache like those old frontier marshals had. And he came over and with a smile, he lifted me off of those logs and he said, "This cabin's really old and probably would be best if you didn't climb on that." Later on, much later on, I found out that this Uncle Oz was from my great-grandfather's first family. He was the mayor of Afton, Wyoming, and he lived to be into his 90s, which he probably was at the time he plucked me off the corner of that log cabin. But I found out later that he told my mother's mother, he said, "You know, Jane," he said, "I was almost your father instead of your brother." And she said, "Well, how could that be?" And he said, "Well, I was courting your mother. I brought her home for dinner after church one day, and my father, who was a Scotsman, took him aside and he said, 'Oz,' he said, 'I want you to leave Mary Smith alone.' And he said, 'Why, Dad?' And he said, 'Because I'm going to marry her.' And he did. And he was a miller. He'd been trained in Scotland to be a miller. and he was working in the mill that was in the middle of the Logan River. And when Mary Smith became pregnant with my grandmother, their first child, her mother had to hide out in the loft of the old mill so that her husband, who was not legally her husband, wouldn't get arrested. Well, you know, as a young boy growing up, every summer we'd go to Cardston and I would visit with my grandmother, and she would tell me stories. And she'd tell me some of these stories. And she said as a young girl, the church sent her father back to Scotland on a mission. As I got older and began studying history, I learned that they sent him and one of his sons to Scotland on a mission, but it was very convenient because it got him out of the country because the marshals were looking for him. They couldn't look for him in Scotland. But here was this young mother with a little child, and my grandmother remembered going into the Logan Temple at night to do janitor work in the temple, and so the church had a reason to pay her, which was the church's way of supporting her while her husband was in Scotland. My grandmother told me stories about that, told me stories about living up in a little place called Freedom, Wyoming. You know, a few years ago, I kind of went away for an extended vacation for about 6 years and the state picked up the full tab. It was, I had free rent, and I had free food, and I had free laundry service, and I had free security protection. I just didn't have any freedom. But when I got out and came back home, I wanted my family to learn about the roots, and I just before I went to prison in 2001, I stopped in southern Idaho and found that cabin that my Uncle Oz had plucked me off the corner of. And this was the cabin where my great-grandmother had been raised. And when I went looking for it, it was in a little tiny town called Benida, which is a combination of Bannock County, Idaho. So they just crunched it together and called this little farming community Benida. It's kind of west of Preston, Idaho. And I was driving around it because I'd heard that this cabin still existed, and I wanted to see it. There was a man came out to his mailbox, saw me kind of wandering around, and asked if he could help me. And I said, yeah, there's a cabin around here. And so he told me how to find the cabin. He said, why are you looking for that cabin? I said, well, my great-grandmother was raised in that cabin. And he smiled. He said, everybody in this town had a great-grandparent that was raised in that cabin. And then he had to tell me about his brother, who had been the president of Ricks College and was now a general authority in the LDS Church. He said, surely you heard of Joe J. Christiansen? I said, yeah, I think he used to be at the Institute at the University of Utah, didn't he? He said, well, yeah, but he's in the first quarter of the 70 now. And I said, oh, well, I'm not too familiar with that now. I haven't been to church for quite a while. And then I explained to him why. And he was done talking with me. I think he wasn't happy about the idea that I too had an ancestor that grew up with his ancestor. But after I got out of prison in 2007, I wanted to take my family to see this cabin. I wanted them to understand their heritage and their history. And so I asked my mother if she would go with us. And we picked her up, and we also wanted to take the family to Yellowstone. Many of my family had never seen Yellowstone. So we had kind of a caravan, about 4 or 5 vehicles, including our 15-passenger van, but it wasn't nearly enough to hold us all. And I remember we picked my mother up at her home in Holiday, and it was her 93rd birthday. She's, in a few more months, she's going to turn 99. So this was about 6 years ago. But we had my mother with me, and she doesn't like talking about history, and she especially doesn't like talking about her mother's history. She likes to point out that her mother was always embarrassed of the fact that she was illegitimate. Her mother hated plural marriage. Her mother said, I'm nothing but a bastard because my parents were not legally married. And that was what my mother grew up with, and that's what I was raised with. But I studied enough history to find that there was more to it than what my mother had been told. So I asked her to come with us, and when we got to that cabin, she actually relaxed enough to start telling stories that she'd heard from her mother. And we videotaped it, and I had all of my family in there at the time. And I thought, you know, my mother may not be around for more than another year or so. I stayed at her home a year or two ago, and when we had a daughter in the hospital, and it was interesting. I was in the bedroom next to her, and she takes her hearing aids out at night and then gets in bed and says her prayers. And with her hearing aid out, she says her prayers loud enough so that she can still hear what she's saying, which is quite loud. And it was interesting to hear my mother pray and thank Heavenly Father for all of her different blessings, and she enumerated them, and she says, and I thank you for my good health. And then she paused and said, even though I really would rather just die. I asked her the next morning at breakfast why she asked Heavenly Father, why she told Heavenly Father she'd rather die. And she said that, well, almost all of my friends are on the other side, and I've done everything here and been everywhere I want to go. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go. I said, but Mom, we want you here. And she said, well, you don't need me. And then she says, you never come see me enough anyway, which is probably true. And she said, and I said, but you know, if you just hang on a few more years, you can make it to 100. She says, why do I care about that? Well, if she hangs on about another 15 more months, she will make it to 100, whether she wants to or not. But it was interesting to me to see her actually relax enough to tell my children the history. And she told them the story about how her uncle had been courting her mother when her grandfather married her. I mean, courting her mother's mother. And I remember my grandmother telling me stories about things that she remembered, even as a 5-year-old, going by covered wagon all the way to Cardston. That was in about 1992, or 1892. And they were traveling with another family that was getting outside the United States so that they wouldn't be arrested by the marshals. The other family name was Levitt. They were a great uncle of our former governor, Mike Levitt. I was speaking with David Levitt, who was the prosecutor in our county that prosecuted me successfully. And I was talking with him. I said, you know, you had a great uncle that had to run away from the United States and go to Canada to keep from being arrested for being a polygamist. He says, yeah, I'm familiar with that. And I said, well, they traveled with just one other family. That was my great-grandfather. I said, there was a time when our families were working close together to keep the principle of plural marriage alive. I said, what are we doing now, David? He says, I'm doing what I have to do. I'm doing my duty. But my grandmother told me stories that her father told her about going out to the fight in the Echo Canyon War when Johnston's army came to Utah. And so it was these kind of stories that got me interested in history. And as a young man, hearing stories from my grandmother about her father's experience going out to fight against the United States Army, that was really difficult for me to grasp. And I wanted to know more, and I began to study and take classes, and ultimately spent a lot of time in the church archives looking at a lot of the history that people had written in their journals, their diaries, and their letters. I have a daughter who, her and her husband live in Layton with a little child, and a few years ago a friend persuaded her to join the National Guard, and she was single at the time and kind of bored, I guess. And so she joined the National Guard, and she went back to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri to boot camp. And when she graduated, I was able to get permission to go back there and watch her graduate. I had permission from the parole office. And when she graduated, there she was all decked out in her uniform, and I was so proud of her. What she had accomplished. Her drill sergeant came up and said she was just the top of the class, and a lot of the men in this squad, she put them to shame with things that she would do, and she's just such a beautiful, feminine, lovely young woman. I had no idea that she loved shooting the .50 caliber machine gun so much, but as we were taking pictures of her at graduation, I said, well, now you've gone over to the other side. She said, well, what do you mean? I said, you know, your great-great-grandfather, he went to war against the United States Army. And she thought about it. She said, well, yeah, I guess I'm fighting for the other side now. But this history has always fascinated me. And so because of that, I would go and visit with Brother Artel in his office, and he would tell me some of the stories of the history of the order. He told me about a time when the order was opening a store in a place, as I recall at the time, it was called Dragerton. I think it's called East Carbon now. And I don't know how long ago this was, but he told me that the founders of the order kind of had an understanding with the leaders of the church back in the 1930s or 40s that they would not interfere with each other's work, that they would not speak ill of each other, that they wouldn't bother each other, that they would respect what each other were doing. But by the time this store was opened by the order in Dragerton, a Mormon apostle, who I later learned in doing research with Knut Knudsen, he had been the editor of the Deseret News. His name was Marky Peterson, and I think he really wanted to be an apostle because he hired a journalism student from BYU to follow the apostles around to see if any of them had more than one wife. And they got the goods on one of the apostles, Apostle Richard Roswell Lyman, in 1942. They got the police chief, Vetterly of Salt Lake, who was not a Mormon, and some of his police officers and a couple of the LDS apostles, and they went and broke down the door of Richard Lyman's plural wife's home. And there was Richard Lyman in his late 70s and his plural wife. He was reading the paper and she was darning socks, and they said, aha, you are committing adultery. And so Marky Peterson published in the newspaper that a Mormon apostle has been found committing adultery. In fact, when I was speaking with some of the church leaders years ago, trying to find out about this information, Henry Richards, who was a cousin to Stephen L. Richards, one of the apostles that was there, he said, well, it was just so heartbreaking. We found out that Brother Lyman, who was one of the most spiritual apostles we had, whenever he spoke, people just felt the Spirit. But then we found out that he'd been committing adultery for 20 years with the same woman. I said, 20 years? That doesn't sound like a fling, it sounds like a wife. He says, oh no, it wasn't plural marriage. But I've since seen a letter that Richard Lyman wrote in the early 1960s to his nephew, who was a physician in Delta, Utah, explaining that this was his plural wife, that she'd been sealed by proper authority by a previous Mormon apostle back in the 1920s, and that he understood that she would be his wife in eternity. I interviewed, just before I went to prison, I interviewed a man who was a constitutional law professor at the University of Utah named Edwin B. Firmage. I was actually didn't plan on interviewing him. I planned on talking to him about my chances on appeal, which he said were pretty nil at that time. But since I was there and I had my friend Knut Knudsen with me, we took advantage of the fact that his middle name is Brown. His mother was the daughter of Hugh B. Brown, who was a counselor to David O. McKay in the first presidency. And we were talking to him about history and quizzing him. And I had heard a rumor when I first became a fundamentalist in the early 80s. And some of the people in the All Red group told me that David O. McKay had been a polygamist, and I just didn't believe it. I've found that wherever you find folk, you find lore. And every group I've ever, of people of any kind, whether it's religious or civic or just a community, wherever you have folklore. And I just assumed that this was fundamentalist folklore. And I still assumed it, clear up until 2001. But then we asked Edwin B. Firmage. He told us that for a year and a half before his grandfather died, he interviewed his grandfather and published his grandfather's autobiography. And we said, did Did you ever hear any rumors of President McKay, who was the president of the church when I was an LDS missionary in the late 60s? Did you ever hear any rumors that President McKay had a plural wife? He said, you know, I had heard those rumors. And so I asked my grandfather if he'd ever heard those rumors. And his grandfather, who had been David O. McKay's first counselor, said, and this is a quote, he said, I and the other brethren, meaning the other general authorities, always understood that President McKay's secretary, Claire Middlemiss, was his plural wife. Even though I was about to go to prison for living the principle, I was still shocked. I was blown away. I really did not believe that there were any leaders of the church in my lifetime who were still living the principle. But here was, from President McKay's counselor's mouth, the fact that he and the other brethren understood that Claire Middlemiss, who'd been President McKay's secretary for about 35 years, that's a pretty long time to work for one person, was his plural wife. My cousin in Canada, my oldest cousin, when I was being prosecuted, she communicated with me by email, and she said, I don't understand why the state is bothering you. She said, when I grew up here in Cardston, it was an open secret that our stake president, and who was also the temple president, had a wife in Cardston and a wife in Salt Lake. Her stake president was Edward J. Wood, and I'd done a lot of research about him. And I'd gone to my mother one day, I'd been in the genealogy library, and there were family group sheets for Edward J. Wood. And he had children with two sisters, Elizabeth Skidmore Hardy and her sister. And I said, Mother, did you know that your stake president in Canada was a polygamist? She said, well, yes, I knew that. I said, how did you know that? And she said, well, I remember when I was a teenage girl, her uncle, Joseph Smith Lowe, he was born on Joseph Smith's birthday. Joseph Smith Lowe had, he was the mayor of Cardston, and his wife, Marge, was walking down the hall in the church one day with my mother, who I think she said she was about 13, when they were passing the stake president, President Edward J. Wood, and her Aunt Marge stopped Edward J. Wood, and chastised him for having a wife in Canada and a wife in Salt Lake, and asked him what on earth he thought he was doing, you know, keeping two wives. And this would have been in about the 1930s that this would have happened. And I asked my mother how President Wood responded. She said, well, I don't remember how he responded. I later found a woman who grew up around the corner from my mother in Cardston. Her name at that time was Lucy Forsyth. She married a man in Mesa, Arizona named Homer Phelps. And Homer Phelps' grandfather had settled Mesa, Arizona. They're a very active LDS family. And one day, Homer Phelps told me that one day in 1953, their bishop stood up in church and said, we need some families to volunteer to take in refugees. We're going to have a need for refugees sometime in the future, in the near future. And so he said, well, sure, we'll take in refugees. And the refugees turned out to be children from Short Creek, as it was called in those days. And here came these fundamentalist children to live in Homer Phelps's home. And of course, somehow, obviously, the church was already pre-positioning homes for those children to go into. And Homer came to understand that it was his responsibility to make good Mormon children out of these kids from Short Creek. In time, as these children lived in his home, he said they were some of the most well-behaved children he'd ever seen, even more so than the children in his ward. And he couldn't understand why they were so well-behaved. And they were so respectful. They just had a higher standard. I remember picking up some of my boys from a Boy Scout leadership training camp called Timberline. And one of the leaders there took me aside. He said, could I speak with you a few minutes? And we went over and sat down on a picnic table. He said, now, you were LDS once, weren't you? And I said, yes. He said, you went on a mission? I said, yes. He said, well, so did I. So we understand each other. He said, but what I don't understand is all these boys we've had at this camp all week, they're all LDS boys, except for yours. And he said, and your boys are so much more respectful than our other boys. And he gave me several examples. He said, what are we doing wrong? What are you doing right that's causing this kind of a result? There were a lot of things I could have told him, but he wouldn't have liked to hear it. We don't watch broadcast television. We had a whole list of things that we did differently in raising our children, but I didn't want to get into those issues with this man, and I also didn't want to make him feel bad. I said, well, maybe it's because they have a lot of mothering, since they had a lot of mothers. But here Homer Phelps was telling me that he had this same experience with these fundamentalist children that came out of Colorado City in 1953. And later the men who were the fathers of these children got out of jail in Kingman, Arizona, and were allowed to come and visit their children. So when these men came to visit their children living with Homer, he began to discuss the gospel with them and history. And he became interested in their perspectives. It was different than the perspective Homer had been raised with all of his life. By this time, Homer, I think, was a top executive with IBM and was a very wealthy man. But he told me that he was taking a trip to Salt Lake, and he and his wife, Lucy, who grew up by my mother in Canada, they decided to stop in to Short Creek and just see what was really going on there. He said that before he even got home from that trip, his bishop had been notified that he had visited Short Creek and called him to a trial for his membership. He thought that he hadn't committed any serious transgression of church's laws, but he said, I'm within my rights to go and visit people. And they didn't think so, so they excommunicated Homer, but he ended up moving his family to Colorado City. And he used his wealth to buy up what remaining land was still available there. And over the years, he transferred pieces at a time to what became the FLDS church down there. But he had a home he'd built kind of up on a hill, on a rocky cliff overlooking Colorado City. And years later, they left Colorado City, moved to St. George. They were quite old at the time that I met them. And they wanted to sell their home in Colorado City. I told him that, he said, nobody will make me a decent offer. They offer me about 1/10 of what the home is worth. And he said, if you're going to Colorado City, my wife Beth had a daughter that was living there at the time, and we would visit her sometimes. And he said, well, if you ever need a place to stay when you're in Colorado City, our home is furnished, including a beautiful grand piano that Homer used to give piano lessons on there in the town. And he said, you can stay in the house. So we did. We stayed in the house. And I said, Homer, I think maybe I could help you sell your house. He said, how's that? And I said, I could just tell everybody in Colorado City I'm thinking of buying it. And so we did. I remember talking to David Dockstader. He says, where are you staying? I said, we're staying in Homer Phelps' house. We're thinking about buying it. And before I got back to Salt Lake, they'd offered him a full price offer for that house. Homer was really happy. I should have gotten a real estate commission on that, but I'm not licensed, so that wouldn't be legal. But when I was in that home, there was this picture board that Lucy Phelps had on the wall. And there was a picture of Lucy as a young woman on horseback next to another young man on horseback. And it was my uncle Alonzo, my uncle Lonnie, who was a big cattle rancher before he died up there in Alberta. So I went back and asked Lucy, I said, I saw a picture of you and my uncle Lonnie. And she said, well, I was dating him before he married your Aunt Mary. And then she was telling me about going back to Cardston after the 1953 raid. She was visiting her folks up there in Cardston, and her father had been the banker in the town, and so they were quite well-to-do, and they'd had a woman that had worked for their family who was kind of a housekeeper, maid, nanny combination. And she was just visiting with some of her family. She said, whatever happened to that lady? And they said, oh, didn't you hear? She said, well, hear what? They said, well, she went to work for a rancher who was an LDS member there in southern Alberta. And this rancher, his wife, had been in an accident. She was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. And this woman went to work as a caretaker for this rancher's wife. And after living with the rancher and his wife for many years, they told Lucy that the rancher and his wife went to President Wood, the stake president, the temple president, and the rancher's wife said, President Wood, I'm not able to give my husband any children. And this woman that's been living with us is like part of our family. Can't she become my husband's wife so he can have some posterity? And President Wood said, well, sure she can. And he took the three of them into the Cardston Temple in about 1948 or 49 and performed a plural marriage with all three of them present. And the woman went back and began having a posterity with this rancher. That's the latest I've been able to find any incident of a plural marriage being performed in a Latter-day Saint temple. And that was somewhere just near the beginning of my lifetime. I would just encourage you to take a look around you at some of the people whose hair may have turned a little lighter color than it was when they were younger. Or some of the other people who've been around a while, even if they're not that old, start asking them about their histories. Brother Paul and Brother Daniel here, they used to come to my home with their father, and their father's gone now. I treasure the opportunities I had of visiting with their father. I even told Brother Daniel that I had interviewed his father on cassette. And unfortunately, Brother Daniel, I can't find those cassettes. I went back out to where we lived before I went to prison, and I had them in a cassette case, and I think somebody came and plundered the house. And I had several hours of interviews about history with Brother Artel. He told me stories that his father, Brother C.W. Kingston, had told him. He told me a story that his father told him about working on the railroad in Idaho Falls with another man whose daughter had become the plural wife of a stake president. Well, in the early 1920s, in the 19-teens, because of the 1882 revelation in which the Lord told John Taylor, it's not meet that men should preside in my priesthood who do not live this principle, men were almost commanded by John Taylor and his successors to live the principle. But after the manifesto, they had to tell them, you can't let us know. I'll tell you one short story about a man named Summerhays, who was sent from Bountiful to the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming to help colonize it in the early 1900s. And he was set apart to be the stake president up there. I'm not sure it was Summerhays. Sessions. That's right. Yes, it was Sessions. Brother Paul knows this story. Well, the story that I heard was that he was told that as a stake president, he had to live the principle to be in keeping with the 1882 revelation. But they also told him, but we don't want to know about it. This was Joseph F. Smith, who said, I have to be able to say I have no knowledge of this, and so don't tell me. Don't tell anybody. Well, sometime later, they had a stake conference up there in the Bighorn Basin, and different general authorities would go to the different stake conferences, and this time it was the man that was the head of the Quorum of the 12, Francis M. Lyman. Now, Francis M. Lyman, I have this theory that I think he felt like if he could embarrass Joseph F. Smith enough into resigning his presidency of the church, Francis M. Lyman would have been next in line to take over. Francis M. Lyman was a little embarrassed because his father, who was an apostle, Amasa M. Lyman, had been excommunicated from the church. And I think Francis M. wanted to kind of restore the family name. Well, so he's sitting on the stand next to President Sessions, and they're singing the opening hymn. And during the singing the opening hymn, he leans over to President Sessions. He says, "By the way, Brother Sessions, President Sessions," he said, "have you entered the principle?" And of course, he'd been instructed to deny that he had, and so he said, "No." And then as the song continued, President Sessions thought, gosh, I wonder if he's asking on behalf of President Smith, who instructed me to live the principle. And so he leaned over and he said, "Brother Lyman," he said, "did President Smith ask you to ask me that?" And he said, "Well, yes, he did," which I think was probably a lie. And he said, "Well, then you may tell him that I have complied with the law." So when the song ended, they had the opening prayer, and then Francis M. Lyman leaned over to President Sessions. He said, "I'm going to release you today and replace you. Who would you like your replacement to be?" And he said, "My counselor." And so he was released right on the spot. Francis M. Lyman became one of those first crusaders against the principle. It was interesting that when he died, he, on his deathbed, asked that his son replace him in the Quorum of the 12. Well, the Quorum of the 12 is not a hereditary office, but out of respect, they put his son, who was a civil engineer professor at the University of Utah, Richard R. Lyman, in his place. Ironical as it is, a woman that Francis M. Lyman had excommunicated from the church because she married a bishop in Rexburg, Idaho, as a plural wife. The bishop, by the way, wasn't excommunicated. He was sent into exile in Arizona for 10 years, then he was brought back to Idaho, where he still functioned in the church. But this woman, Annie Sophie Jacobs, she was still excommunicated. So she went to Francis M. Lyman's son and said, "Your father cut me off from the church, and I'd like to get back in the church." And he listened to her story, and he felt compassionate for her. Both he and Annie Sophie Jacobs were in their late 50s at the time. He had her baptized in a ward different from the ward she was living in. Knut Knudsen and I one day found her membership record stuck in a whole different ward's records in the church archives. It had a note on it from Richard R. Lyman saying, "Send her record directly to me." So he had her records separated, and then on November 27th, 1927, he took Annie Sophie Jacobs, this woman his father had excommunicated, as a plural wife. And that was the woman that he was caught with in 1942, as the Deseret News reported it, committing adultery. And it was the Deseret News editor, Marky Peterson, who exposed Richard R. Lyman and then was given Richard R. Lyman's seat in the Quorum of the 12, I guess, as a reward. And for the rest of Apostle Peterson's life, he spent his time trying to ferret out anybody in the church that had any sympathy for fundamentalists or for the principle, whether they lived it or not, and excommunicating them. The Lord in the Doctrine and Covenants says that the wheat and the tares will grow together. Brigham Young, in a speech, said that the wheat and the tares will grow together in the church until the Lord will say, "Gather my wheat out from among the tares." I showed this to my mother, this speech, and I says, "Look, Mother, the Lord says that the wheat will be gathered out from among the Latter-day Saints." Well, Knut Knudsen and Fred Collier and I were living in my office years ago and doing a lot of research and watching Marky Peterson excommunicate different people. And some of the people he was excommunicating were really good people. Henry Richards had been set apart by the first presidency to help rescue Mormons who were interested in fundamentalism. And I had several interesting meetings with him. And he came to speak at my mother's ward, and I happened to be at my mother's house. The church had given my first wife enough money and help to leave me. So my first wife and my 3 children were taken away from me, in essence, by various church leaders. My own stake president sat right in front of my wife and I and told my wife if she didn't leave me, she was going to go to hell and never have her children in eternity. And they succeeded in taking her away from me. And Henry Richards helped her. He gave her money to do that. But then he came to speak at my mother's ward because I happened to be living in my old bedroom in my mother's basement again. And my mom said, Henry Richards is going to speak tonight at a fireside. And I said, really, can I come? She said, well, I'll only let you come if you promise not to raise your hand and say anything. I said, I promise I'll be good, Mother. And so I sat in the very back of the room while he gave this whole explanation to the people in my mother's ward up in Holiday about the fundamentalists and who they were and what they were about. And I remember that Sister Rigby, she raised her hand. She said, well, who are these people getting involved in fundamentalism? And Henry Richards, who didn't realize I was there in the back of the room, he said, you'd be amazed. He says, it's not the foolish people in the church who get drawn off into these fundamentalist groups. He says it's some of the best and brightest members that we have. Some of the most dedicated people, some of the most faithful people, seminary teachers who study too much of the gospel, for example, or converts who join the church and keep studying the gospel. And so afterwards, I was in the back having punch and cookies with some of the old people in the ward that I'd grown up around, because I'd been a small child in that ward. And I was visiting with some of my old neighbors. And my mother went up and greeted Henry Richards and thanked him for his comments. And she said, Tom is here. And he said, oh, Tom is here. So he came all the way to the back of the room to greet me. And he said, I hope I didn't say anything to make you feel bad. I said, no, Henry. I said, I loved your talk. I said, especially the part when you said it was the best and the brightest who were leaving the church to join the fundamentalists. I wanted to stand up and say, and don't any of you wonder why? But when these people were being excommunicated, my friends Knut Knudsen and Fred Collier and I, we thought about Brigham Young's prophecy that the wheat would be gathered out from among the Latter-day Saints. And we thought, Marky Peterson is actually helping the Lord in this gathering. We should prepare a Golden Harvester Award, and every time he excommunicates one of these best and brightest from the church, we should send him a certificate thanking him for cutting out some of the wheat from among the tares. But we also thought that that wouldn't be a kind thing to do. Well, now to finish my story so that we can end the meeting, because my family knows how I like to tell stories. Brother Artel told me that Marky Peterson came down to Dragerton. There were 2 LDS wards in that town, and he spoke to both of them in their sacrament meetings. Of course, to have an apostle come to your ward, especially a place like East Carbon, that's a pretty significant thing. But the reason that Marky Peterson went there was because the order was going to have a grand opening of their store the next day, and he wanted to warn all the Mormons in that town not to do any business in that store. And I'm sure this story's not news to some of you older folks here. Some of you probably could tell it better than I. I'm just telling it the way Brother Artel told me. And I was shocked that they would do that. I said, well, Brother Artel, that's not in keeping with the agreement that you folks had with the leaders. And actually, I was wanting Brother Artel's permission to let me contact some investigative reporters about what happened to the United Bank that the order had, that Brother Daniel used to operate. I was one of his customers. And Brother Artel said, I said, but they haven't kept their end of the bargain. And he said, that's all right, we're going to keep our end of the bargain. It doesn't matter to us how they keep their end. Our job is to keep our end of the bargain. And I began to learn more about the order and about the people in it from some of those stories and those experiences. By the way, Brother Artel told me that, I said, well, how did the store do? He says, well, it was pretty difficult at first. I can imagine that it was. But he said in time, most of the people would rather shop there than drive all the way into Price. And so ultimately the store did okay. He said, in fact, we would open accounts for people so that they could, buy things and then pay on account when they got paid. And he said, and ultimately, the bishop of each of the 2 wards there had accounts in our store. I said, wait a minute. An apostle came and told those bishops in their wards not to shop at your store, and the bishops themselves shopped at your store? He said, yes, they did. I said, well, how did they explain that? He said, well, I don't know. He said, it was interesting, though, because every once in a while, one of them would be in the store shopping, and he'd see the other one heading into the store. And so he would duck behind one of the shelves until the other bishop came in and he could sneak out, because they didn't want to see each other shopping in a fundamentalist store. Anyway, I just want to tell you all that I'm surprised and grateful for this opportunity to speak to you and share these stories. As I was walking up here, I thought I totally didn't expect this. I have nothing to say. And that's when I realized that you have to follow the Spirit, and you have to kind of go where the Spirit leads you. And so I guess the things that I told you about today are the things that the Spirit brought to my mind to share with you. But I have to tell you that it feels good to be here. My wife was raised in Colorado City, and she has a lot of resentment about Colorado City and the way that things were operated there. And as a result of that, she has become somebody really resistant to, I should say organization, more so than authority, because she's an extremely loyal and devoted wife. But last week, when we sat back here, towards the end of the meeting, before we separated for classes, I leaned over to her and, I'd watched her noticing the people in the congregation. And I said, Shirley, does this remind you of Colorado City? And she said, well, kind of, but it's different than Colorado City. And I said, how's it different? And she said, I can tell that people here have freedom to be who they want to be, freedom to be who they are. And she said, maybe that's why they stay. Maybe that's why they're still here. And she leaned over to me today, and she whispered in my ear, and she said, I feel good here. Now, we've visited fundamentalist meetings off and on for years in Pinesdale, Montana, and back in Missouri and other places, because in my heart, I feel like I have something in common with all the people who respect the principle and want to keep it alive. She has been with me on some of those occasions, and she's always been resistant. In fact, she always is quite outspoken. She is his mother, who's going to be marrying. And I think I may have inherited some of that. I'm sorry, but you may have already learned that speaks her mind too. You'll just have to deal with it as I have. There was one time when this leader in Missouri was speaking and started grumbling about it under her breath, and not quite under her breath. I was afraid she was going to stand up and tell him he was full of it. So I was really quite surprised when she leaned over to me today and she said, I feel good here. I feel good here. And I told her that that's the feeling that I had last week when I was here. And I appreciate the way that the people in the order have always been friendly to my family and I for the last 32 years. And I'm grateful for the friendship and association that I've had with the people in this order. I see Price Johnson's daughter sitting here on the front row. And I met Price Johnson just before he died, because I knew that he was an important historical figure in the history of the fundamentalists. And I was in St. George and ran into his son. And I said, you're Price Johnson's son? And he said, yes. And I said, wow, I didn't know he had children your age. And I said, is he still alive? He said, yes. And I said, where is he? He's in Moccasin, Arizona. So I detoured back to Salt Lake through Kanab so that I could stop by and meet Price Johnson. And my wife is the granddaughter of Elmer Johnson, who was a full brother to Price Johnson. And so she's a second cousin to a lot of people that are sitting here in this room. And her mother is a first cousin to any of Price's children who are in the order. Many years ago,
He keeps name dropping, so I'm just going to tell you what he's saying. He's talking about how years ago he was married to this wife that he keeps name dropping that's from the FLDS. He was married to her mother as well, and this story is about them. And I don't know why he's even telling it, but here you go.
And we went to buy some coal for our stoves out in the West Desert. Stopped into Valley Coal, where I was regularly purchasing bags of coal. And I went in to pay for it there at the Scale House. And
He went into Valley Coal and he met my grandma, Isabel Johnson, and he introduced his wife and his wife's mother, who is also his wife, to my grandma, Isabel Johnson. Still boring.
I said, I want to introduce you to Isabel Johnson. I said, she's your first cousin. And they both looked at each other and said, how are we cousins? I said, well, your father was Elmer and her father was Price, and they were full brothers. Raised down there at Lee's Ferry, which is a whole nother story. I won't get into it today. I'll just bear you my testimony of the work of the Lord and of the truthfulness and correctness of the principles of God, and that they're worth standing up for no matter what it costs you. I express my love and gratitude to the people here today and the opportunity we've had of being invited to attend your meetings with you. I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
We'll take the next 5 minutes meditation.
Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, I don't know how you did that because I literally had to take breaks from listening to this man. So bravo to you. I'm trying to clap, but I'm holding up my phone with my other hand. If you would like a therapist recommendation after this episode, then let me know. Instagram me. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you on the next episode of Culty Cup of Coffee. Bye.